Well, here we are again for another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. Welcome back, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back.
Yep, it's always good to be back for another deep dive. So today we're going to be dissecting another one of your articles titled A Disappearing Act. Where did all the Phoenicians go? And, without giving anything away, I think this is a good little precursor to get our listeners set up. Here in this article, you specifically look at the timeline after the fall of some ancient Phoenician cities, where it appears the Phoenicians apparently seem to vanish. But then we see Jewish communities appear all over the place. So that's a little bit of a precursor. Let's dive straight into episode 16 of On Air, titled A Disappearing Act.
Well, yeah, this topic was one of the reasons I sort of began looking into the Phoenicians in the first place. Because the enigma of the Jewish people has always fascinated me. How such a small group of people, so widely dispersed around the world, have so much influence in finance, media, and government in almost every nation that they reside. And they could be such a minute part of that population, and they still hold significant influence. So I was going, who are these people? Why are they like that? I mean, you don't think of, I don't know, another Maltese people who are, small minority, or Kiwis having the same kind of influence. It doesn't make sense in that regard when, and then they use this, the whole IQ reasoning behind why they are so, have so much influence because they're smarter than everyone else. But looking into that doesn't add up either. So, that's why I wanted to look into this. And what I found was the key to understanding the Jewish question and our history and current world events, because it's all linked, is not to read the Bible as a history book. And this is the mistake that many people do, and many Christians as well. Only once that you accept that those stories are fables, only then will you begin to see the truth. Otherwise, just forget it. You'll never get it, because what they've done is they've created this mystical people from these stories, these ancient, God-chosen, special people. If you're going with that as the history, you forget it. That whole thing was created as a veneer to obscure the true history and nature of these people. So if you're following that path, don't even bother looking into it, okay? And this brings me on to another point that I have found with my research as opposed to a lot of other researchers. If you're going to look at the historical question, now if you come to it with beliefs already in place, how are you going to discern fact from fiction? You can't go at it with already held beliefs. I know it's hard. This is difficult to do, and even for myself, because we do tend to hold beliefs in certain aspects of our lives, be it medicine, science, religion, whatever. But you got to try and get rid of it as much as possible, because otherwise it's a fruitless task. You're not going to understand.
You mentioned fables. People could argue that they're metaphors, and it is metaphorical or an
allegorical as well.
Allegorical as well as Plato.
Okay, see, this is that you bring up a good point. The Bible is a book of the mind and the spirit. Correct. And that's how it should be approached. They're talking about your mind and they're talking about the spirit. In order to have some kind of connection with God, God isn't here like a person, a physical person. He's a spirit. It's the divine. That's how you need to speak to it, and that's how you need to approach it. But people have
taken it literally. They've taken the Bible literally.
And that happened in the 15th. I don't believe the Bible was written from the beginning with that in mind, that purpose. I believe that happened with the Protestant Reformation. That happened later. When you push all that aside and you just look at the Jewish question, what I found was a very strong connection between those people and their character and those of the ancient Phoenicians. And that is why I started looking into Phoenicians to begin with, and then created Phoenician Hunter and everything. It was really to answer this Jewish question.
Funny you should mention Phoenicians, like the Hebrews, I guess. I think you say that they were a Canaanite people, and so for clarity reasons, I just want to say Canaanites refer to those ancient people who were in the region of Canaan, which is around modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, exactly. So the name Phoenicians was actually a title given to them by others. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Canaanites. And from whichever city they lived in, for example, if they were in Syria or Tyre or Carthage, they still refer to themselves as Canaanites, not Syrian or Carthaginians. They refer to themselves as Canaanites, which simply means, the word means merchant or trader or that's where we get banker. So
Oh,
they refer to themselves as merchants.
that goes back again, interconnection of your stories with merchants and trading. This is fantastic.
I just want to bring up another point, that we're here to present ideas, and proving anything 100% is almost impossible, right,
Yes.
for any researcher. What I try to do is base my ideas on evidence and sound logic. So the only real truth is what one experiences firsthand. So that means you experience it directly, you see it, you feel it, you touch it. Everything else they call second-hand evidence or, hearsay. In a court of law. And also, we need to keep in mind that new evidence can always be uncovered, so then it throws into question your idea or your claim or your fact. I just wanted to say that so, people are aware that, again, the best way to approach history is from a clean slate. So that's why I said you need to remove all beliefs when you come to it. And also all programming, because that's important too. We've been programmed since we were children, from the education system, media, our parents even. So just to be aware of that, that's all. I just wanted to bring up that point.
So it's a good caveat to include. But again, my point, bringing it back to the topic of what we're discussing today. So where did these Phoenicians go?
Okay, so when I was reading documents and books from other historians, they always seemed puzzled by the disappearance of the Phoenicians, particularly in the first century. And they also had difficulty explaining the rapid growth of Judaism as well amongst similar people like other Semites and people living around them. And what they found was a lot of Phoenicians, they say, converted to Judaism. Okay?
Well, if I can just interject just briefly here, there's a quote in your article from the author H.G. Wells, which a lot of people will know, his best-selling, War of the Worlds, Time Machine, etc. And he stated that after the fall of Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, and the Spanish Phoenician cities, he believes that the Phoenicians suddenly vanished from history, right? And this is the work that he's done. And then suddenly we will find that it's not simply in Jerusalem, but in Spain, Africa, Egypt, Arabia, the East, wherever the Phoenicians had set their feet, communities of Jews. So how does this tie into what you've just said?
So reading that, I came across that, and that was like, wow, a light switch went on, and I said, wow, that's what I had been levitating towards. That was my research was going into that direction as well. And then there was someone else saying the same exact thing, that wherever these communities of Jews sprung up were previously cities belonging to the Phoenicians. So it's almost like a switch happened. It's not that Jews came in there. It's that they were still Phoenician, that all of a sudden the Phoenicians became Jews.
They converted for whatever reason, yeah.
Okay, so now we'll get into that whole word conversion later on. But
yeah, of course.
But that's what happens. So they say, after Phoenicia loses its power, consequently from the Punic Wars, and these cities and colonies, they say they just sort of disappeared, basically. This is what the historians say. But then we find in those cities that the growth and appearance of Jews. And Spain as well, like Spain comes up a lot. And we need to remember that Spain was known as Iberia.
Can I just interject here? Because this is what struck me. Are you suggesting that these are the Sephardic Jews or the Sephardim of Spain?
So experts say the Jewish communities have been there in Spain as early as the 1st century AD. So that's about 2,000 years ago. So let's think of this logically. They say after 2,000 years, these people have still kept themselves separate from the host nation and not integrated or mixed. 2,000 years. Keep that in mind, 2,000 years, they haven't integrated. So as well as I do, right, coming from a multicultural country, which we grew up in, that even just after 2 generations, it's almost impossible to hold on to that original culture and custom and language that your parents brought over as immigrants. It's almost impossible. And then, what happens, your brother or you might marry someone else who's from a different culture and just slowly, that's how it happens. You lose it. And also I've noticed this amongst Jews as well. Like where I grew up in Australia, I've known Jews who are married outside their faith. And are you trying to tell me, these historians are trying to tell us that after 2,000 years, they still kept themselves separate? Again, the logic doesn't apply with...
Well, in the article based on what you've just told us, you also point out that the word Iberia in Italian is Iberica, and the word Hebrew translates to Hebraica.
Very similar.
Of course.
So what they're saying is, if you look at the etymology, that Spain is the land of the Hebrews. Because if Hebrew is Hebraica and they've called the land Ibrea, so it's the land of the Hebrews. That's their original land, not Jerusalem. Okay,
Yep.
and that has a whole nother meaning and a whole nother story behind it, which was a modern invention,
Yes.
as that was the holy place. It wasn't originally known as the holy place. It was somewhere else. Okay.
So based on that, and you're saying that this all appears to be coincidental, could you perhaps take us through some of the similarities between the Phoenicians and Jews? And maybe that should clarify things a little.
How much time do we have?
Yes, of course.
No, okay, it's almost every. So this is what happened. When I looked into the Phoenicians, I was saying, are they talking about Phoenicians here or Jews? I mean, the similarities were ridiculous. So language, it's almost the same language. The Hebrew language is a Canaanite Phoenician dialect. I remember hearing one historian say that you go back far enough and you won't be able to tell the difference between the two. Okay, and this brings me up to another point. So historians say ancient language like Sumerian, ancient Egyptian, and all these other ancient languages were lost and forgotten. But somehow Hebrew, who they claim is probably one of the oldest, was still survived into the modern era, where everything else has died. And even Latin, is pretty much dead and buried.
Sure.
But somehow that survived. And the other similarities I found were, their religion. I mean, just look into Judaism and you'll see it came out of the Canaanite religion. I mean, the gods are all the same. The word El, from the word Israel, is a Canaanite god. Elohim that you read about in the Bible is
Yes.
Canaanite. It's from the Canaanite religion.
Yeah.
Adonai, again, is a word that comes from the Canaanites. And all these gods have been adopted by Judaism and brought into the Old Testament as well. So, and then another link again is their occupations. Phoenicians were known predominantly as merchants and traders.
Yes, we know that,
And
yeah.
bankers. And what do we see historically Jews being aligned with doing? Merchants and being merchants and traders. And
That's right.
so when I was looking into it, it's like I was reading the same people, reading about the same people. And then you hear these ridiculous stories that I have found by modern researchers say, or Christians, the only reason they were traders and merchants is because they were forbidden to do other trades. And I'm thinking, what the hell? So if you don't like these people, why would you give them the most influential trades available? Money lending is probably the most influential to your community, to your society, and you're going to give it to your enemy? Get them to dig the dirt. Get them to be farmers, not to run your finances. That doesn't make sense to me. And another thing that has always bothered me is the stories of the ghettos. These poor people, they've been placed in these ghettos, a separate side of the city from everyone else. And in fact, what I heard there is that they wanted to separate from everyone else. It's not that
They were forced out.
Yeah, they were forced to go. They wanted to be away from everyone else, is what I heard. But anyway, the story is told that, okay, so these poor people living in poverty, but somehow these people living in these ghettos and worn down part of town somehow are the accountants for the princes and kings and also lend money to the kings. All right, now let's bring logic into it. If you're a king, why are you going to these poor people and asking them for money? You're the king.
Doesn't make
you
sense.
You own all the mines.
That's
you
right.
own all the gold. And okay, just say you did lend money from these people. Why do you have to pay it back? What are they going to do? You own the army. What are they going to do?
Yeah, the narrative doesn't make sense. But what I want to do, what I want to do at this point is just reassure our listeners that we are simply recounting history, and based on the research that you've done that goes beyond the current narrative. So any accusations of anti-Semitism or that we're going to...
Modern, I'm not playing that modern game, but just modern accusation, modern words, they mean nothing.
Yes,
okay.
okay.
They're there to prevent you from finding the real history and the truth. Just forget it. I'm not going to even entertain that.
I'm glad, and again, I'll take your lead on this. But
Yeah.
look, based on what you've said, said, and I'm going to introduce or at least challenge you on something. There was a distinct custom that these people had in common, and that was circumcision. And that brings me to, a bit of a crossroads for me because, and the only reason I raise this is because there's an article which are from Herodotus and his observations. I think it's in the Histories Book 2, chapter 104, where he discusses circumcision practices amongst ancient cultures. And he writes, in the 5th century BCE, it lists, first of all, the Egyptians, then the Colchians, Ethiopians, Phoenicians, and Assyrians as the earliest practicing circumcision cultures. Now, can you help us make the connection with that tradition?
Yeah, good point. That was another custom that I was unaware of before getting into this research. And again, the Jews claim that circumcision is a special
That's right,
covenant between them, made between God and Abraham and his people. That's it. They're special. No one else is doing this. They are, doing it. And that was a way to have that special relationship that no one else had. So are you telling me that God was unaware that these other people were doing it beforehand? Are you trying to trick God? It just, the more you look into it, the more ridiculous it sounds. And I purposely poke fun at it. I'm poking fun at it because it's ridiculous. The more you look into the Old Testament, the Jewish writings and the New Testament, you see this stuff is borrowed from previous cultures.
This is what I was going to say, is that you make the point that scholars, and you raised this earlier, but maybe expand on it, you make the point that scholars have found that most of the Jews were in fact converts from Phoenicians, correct?
Yep, exactly. And not only Phoenicians, from other Semitic cultures as well. So
that's right.
They said that, scholars have had the difficulty explaining the growth of Judaism throughout the Roman world. It's like these numbers swelled. Why, And they suggest that the majority of these converts were especially Phoenician converts. So that's where where did all the Phoenicians go? This is how the historians explain it. And to them, this also explains how the Phoenicians disappeared and that they just became Jews at the end of the day. So this raises another issue. So I guess the tribes of Israel and that whole special covenant between God and the tribes of Israel isn't really special after all. If anyone can just convert. So if they're accepting converts from everywhere, then what are they doing? Tricking God again? I thought God made that special relationship with those people alone based on
what they're telling us and God's chosen people, etc. Yeah.
Exactly. It's rubbish. And I'm poking fun at it because it's rubbish. And then another theory is after the destruction of the Phoenician cities, right? Like Sidon and Tyre, which were their main ones in the Middle East, and Carthage, a Phoenician diaspora was created, so exactly like the Jews, when the Jews were sort of wandering, so because they shared this similar experience, this led them to sort of convert to Judaism. It's almost like, we're experiencing the same shit, so we might as well follow the same faith. So now the reason that both these people were dispersed is because it's the one bloody event, people. It's not two different people, exactly the same, very similar people experience the same event. It's the same event, right? It happened once, that's it. So you can't separate these people. It's the same event. And that brings me to another point as well. I know I'm ranting here.
I'm going to finish up on the tail end of once you finish your point here.
I just wanted to bring up this. So I believe the story of the Jewish wars as well against the Roman Empire told by Josephus, called the War of the Jews, about the destruction of Judea and the displacement of its people. This is when they get displaced, right? So Judea is destroyed and then the Jewish people are homeless, right? This is exactly the same as the Punic and Roman wars, when Rome destroys Carthage, and again, then all these people are homeless and dispersed. It's the same event. So this is the point where I believe that they start creating Judaism, and then the Phoenicians are turned into Jews. And it seems to me that this story, it seems to be always between Rome versus Phoenicia. And it's become now, with the writings of the scriptures, it's become Rome versus the Jews.
Yes,
okay, so this is where it originated from. It's still the same conflict. Rome, Phoenicia, then it becomes Rome, Carthage, or Carthaginians, and then Rome, Jews. It's the same.
Okay, so two points, and I think both of them are quite critical. One of them is you've mentioned Carthage, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I also, and this is probably more a personal thing for me, is that I hear the word Semites mentioned quite a lot, particularly when you talk about the Jewish faith and the Jewish community. And if you say something that's not so much derogatory, but maybe against their beliefs, you're titled an anti-Semite. Now, I just want to make it clear that Semites, and you can maybe back me up on this, Semites are those which include Jews, Arabic, Aramaic, Akkadian, and they're usually Arabs, Assyrians, Phoenicians. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of the word Semite, but I just want our listeners, if they do or don't already know, that Semites aren't referenced just to the Jewish faith.
Aside from, them using that term, crying anti-Semitic, to shut down the discourse, the other problem with that is that many Jews, and I think it's the majority of them, have no connection with the Middle East or that part of the world where Semites originate. Most of them are of European descent. And this, again, is in line with the research that they originated from Spain, or that's where the doctrine originated. And that's, again, following the works of Edwin Johnson. He believes that the creation of Judaism starts around 1000 to 1200 AD. Okay, so that is why the anti-Semitic, people push back on it, because they say, no, you're not Semites anyway. You're European.
I'm glad that you clarified that, because that's based on history, not just based on a false narrative. So I want to come back to Carthage. You mentioned Carthage in your article, particularly that the community was built of exiles after the destruction of the first temple, who had joined earlier Jews living there, and that some of this community assisted the Phoenicians in establishing Carthage. Can you perhaps expand on that?
Okay, yeah, that was another connection that I found. And, just to raise the article, there's a lot more in there, and I go in depth with a lot of footnotes and resources about the topic that we're discussing today. So what I found was some historians, including Josephus, have associated the founding of Carthage with Jews. So according to Edwin Johnson, the works of Josephus were fake anyway, and they were antedated and probably written in the Middle Ages. Okay,
Right.
So what they're doing by associating Carthage with Jews is putting the Jews back to, an ancient time where they didn't exist. So they're actually Phoenician that founded Carthage. But, they're trying to insert the idea in people's minds from the Middle Ages onwards about these Jews and they're ancient. This is when they start to, to create the Jewish people.
Right.
And it's exactly around the time when they're writing the religious texts. They're writing the texts to put in the Jewish people, basically, and to hide that, the fact that up until that point they were Phoenician.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, good point, because that's a nice little segue into a professor of history at Tel Aviv University that you've mentioned in your article, Shlomo Sand. And
that's his real name, by the way.
Yeah, Shlomo. I know, Shlomo Sand. And he authored what is today considered quite a controversial book titled "The Invention of the Jewish People." Now, you suggest that in his book, that he found absolutely no evidence of the Jewish diaspora. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, and there's a quote in the article.
Okay, yep. Can I maybe run through it? Sorry, I should have I should have maybe expanded on that. But he concluded that the Jewish diaspora is essentially a modern invention, and he accounts for the appearance of millions of Jews around the Mediterranean and elsewhere as something purely that came through the religious conversion of local people, as you've been saying throughout this podcast, saying that Judaism, contrary to, I guess, popular opinion, was very much a converting religion in former times.
He's confirming what I was saying and other historians have been saying as well. And this is relatively a modern book. So he's come to the same conclusions. And, this Jewish professor, had to be honest with the evidence and the facts and put his beliefs aside, and he's come to that conclusion. Quite brave of him not to just follow what everyone else is saying there. So, yeah.
In fear of reprisal or bigotry or anything like that we've been told to
Exactly.
believe. Yeah.
And further to that point, I just want to say that my only objection to his research, or others as well, saying that they view the Phoenicians as converts, so as separate people from the Jews, separate cultures. This is my point of conjecture, is that no, they're the same people. They're not two peoples coexisting throughout history. It's the same people, and what they've done is they were Canaanite. They believed their Canaanite religions one day, and then they rebranded it to Judaism.
In one sense, they've basically hijacked the Phoenicians. Is that what?
Okay.
Could you maybe look? I don't know. This is going to open up
That's
Pandora's
one way to look
box,
at it.
I suppose.
Another way to look at it is to sort of bury the past and create a new modern version of themselves, an updated version. Maybe because Phoenicians had up into that. I mean, at that point, were the enemies of Rome and were considered evil, or don't forget that the Canaanite religion was associated with human sacrifice, child sacrifice. So maybe this was a way to clean the slate, start anew, fresh. I'm not sure. I'm speculating here the reasons for it. The other reason is to obscure their activities as merchant bankers. Probably people maybe realized that their name was associated with corruption or those kind of activities. So it could have been that. But I believe my reason, I believe, is to do with the religious texts. And also we have to understand, if Judaism is a relatively modern overlay, right? So we're looking at 1,000 years ago to 800 years ago, and then, as Johnson says, we discussed this in the previous podcast, where, our chronological table has been altered, where, they've subtracted 700 to 1,000 years. This brings it right up to the modern era. It's like we were discussing last.
It brings Judaism up to the modern era.
Yeah, like we were discussing that we're not that far removed from the Romans and the Greeks, and we're not that far removed from the Phoenicians either. You see, that's what it is. That makes these Phoenicians not ancient people. It makes them, they were around in the late to middle period, Middle Ages. So it brings it right up. So they were around that period, and then they just sort of became called Jews.
Does this bring into question the narrative like the pyramids were built based off the back of Jewish slaves? It would bring into question, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
and I know
that's
a completely of course.
No,
okay.
It just makes me look at that as completely rubbish. That's the other thing, that they put themselves in as victims.
That's right.
These poor slaves. All of a sudden, from being
merchants and traders and bankers to
ruling the world. It's just there's okay. That's the other thing. Good point. All right. So they're these poor people, slaves, victims. That is probably why the Phoenicians invented that narrative. So don't look at us, we're poor, leave us alone. But in actual fact, the Phoenicians, and if you look at the history, what people don't realize is the Phoenicians were the power of the world, just like Rome was afterwards. I mean, Rome took their throne, but before that, it was the Phoenicians. They held all the riches of the world. They were the strongest. Now, they had, they worked differently to the Romans. See, the Romans had strong armies. The Phoenicians never had a large population. So they were always like a small family-based oligarchy, a bit like the Venetians. The Venetians followed that pattern. And most of them, whenever they needed to fight wars, most of their military was made up of mercenaries, paid mercenaries. So it wasn't actually them doing the fighting, because they didn't have the numbers to do so. But, they would have generals that would lead these mercenary armies. They were very, and that's where Hannibal comes into it. They're very clever people in that regard, and tacticians. But in terms of large populations, no. So they were different to the Romans. They were never these slaves and these poor people. They always held power just by a small family group, basically.
They were good PR agents. Before we tie all this together, I want to ask you a personal question, and that is, your research, as we know, and our listeners can read a lot more than just this article and listen to the podcasts at phoenicianhunter.substack.com. Have you had any, I guess, bite back to some of these articles like this one, like Where Did the Phoenicians Go, where you challenge the current narrative of Judaism and the Jewish state?
Yes, I have. And I get attacked. I turn comments off unless you're a paid subscriber, because it sort of filters out the people who just want to, the trolls, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do get attacked quite a bit, and it's usually coming from Christians. So
Okay.
you would think it comes from, Jewish people, and no, it actually comes from Christians. Because for them, if the whole Jewish narrative is false, that throws into question Christianity as well, you see.
That's right. That's
Because
right.
they're all linked. Now, you bring up a good point. They're all linked for a purpose. What has happened, and we've mentioned this before, where I look at old books and I find with time, the narrative changes. Now, this is something that happens all the time. History doesn't stay static, or what they want you to believe as history doesn't stay static. They change it. They change the books. They change the ideas. They change the beliefs. With the Abrahamic religions, it's almost like they reset the world. It was a new doctrine. That's why it's called New Testament, people. New doctrine. And this is all sort of happens around the time, if we follow Edwin Johnson's claim, and I have found the same thing, that this all happens around the Middle Ages, okay? Around the 1500s, what happens there? America is discovered, or as we've mentioned, reopened for business.
That's right.
Okay, so it's sort of rediscovered America. This is when the printing press starts as well. This is when they start pushing out all these Bibles for people to read. Because you got to understand, before that period, who had a Bible? No one.
That's right.
And secondly, who could read? That's another very important point. Not many people could read, in the 1500s. Okay, so no one's reading. So this was the new program. So Christianity was the new program for the European races. But on the back of Judaism and Islam, everyone around the world had this new program to run with. And it's all connected to the commercial world, as I have written about in other articles that we haven't discussed yet. But, I believe that Christianity and Judaism and Islam were also commercial enterprises just as much as they were religious. So this is then we get into a lot of books and ideas about, America was actually discovered by the ancient lost tribes of Israel, because after the collapse of Judea, and these people are dispersed. A lot of them went to America, and and then you get stupid stories where American Indians are descendants of the Israelites, and so what they've done is that story of Phoenicians coming to America was already known and was written about, but what they've done is changed it from Phoenicians to Israelites or Jews, Hebrews. You see. Again, it's that switch. It's that overlay again that I'm talking about.
The switch to control the narrative, and hence here we are today.
And also to make, very important point, to make the Bible a historical book.
Rather than allegorical or metaphorical.
Or a spiritual book rather than what it should be viewed,
That's actually
viewed as, okay?
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people think that, okay, this is, I get attacked as well. Oh, what is he, a pagan, or he's a atheist, and all this other rubbish. And, my faith or my beliefs are personal to me.
Of course.
Just because I don't subscribe to something that is easily identified, because I don't like following things that, someone has constructed for me. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm still on a journey of discovering what it is that I believe.
Maybe also the fact that you've managed to, through history, debunk certain narratives, people reluctant to change, and when you challenge their beliefs, that's when they become...
Look, most people just follow a program. Like they do very literal thinking. It's a program. It's set there. It already exists. I'm just going to follow that one. My parents followed it. It's the same with voting patterns. Like people just vote the same party. Oh, because my dad voted for it and I've voted for 50 years, even though that party might have changed and their policies are completely different. To what they were. People just, I'm just going to follow that. That makes sense to me. It's pre-packaged, ready to go.
Can I say the reason why I love having these discussions with you is that you don't rely on current texts. You go back pre the 1900s, when even experts have said that if you want the true history, then you look at texts predating 1900s. Before the and again, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but before the Rockefellers came in to change the narrative. Okay, so this is why we have these discussions.
Point.
Well, this is why we have these discussions to challenge the narrative, to say to
Yeah.
people, dive into that rabbit hole and read something that's
Okay.
printed before the 1900s, for
Yeah,
example.
and you bring a good point up, because, like I was saying, that the narrative changed in the Middle Ages with the Bible stories. Okay, so
Mm.
these, then the printing press was printing these Bibles, and the first book in the new colonies in America was the Bible. That's what people read. You're not reading anything else. You're reading the Bible. So that is everything. So yeah, the Bible becomes your history book. It becomes your book of faith, your spiritual. It becomes everything. That's it. That answers everything. You don't need to know anything else. So you bring up a good point about, the history and the narrative and how it's changed, and it was changed with the introduction of the Bible, because historically, Rome, they tell us, was founded by refugees from Troy, and this is the same founding for Venice and London as well. The refugees of Troy, after Troy is destroyed, they go look for new lands, and then they set up shop there, right? So a lot of the nobility of the time tried to link their bloodline with Trojan lineage, because it was seen as divine. Okay. Now, this is important, because then that is changed. It's a new overlay. It's changed to Christian narrative, where those lines are no longer divine. Now you've got the lines of David and Jesus and Abraham and Noah. So then the nobility are trying to link to those lines. And this is where people come up with, the crown, the British are the line of David. Okay, they've just changed the story, people. They've just given you a new story, and this might change again. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, but there'll be a new one with a new age, and then a new doctrine, and then we start all over again.
People have already, and this has been, the narrative has been going for a while, but the discussion, I should say, people are already talking about the Sumerians and the Anunnaki, and even going back that far. But that again is quite separate to what we're talking about today. Nevertheless, I understand your point, and I'm sure our listeners do. But just so we can tie all this together, have you got any final words that you can maybe impart based
Yeah.
on what we've discussed in the last half hour?
Okay, just touching on my previous point with the narrative changing, we see this today with, they come out with these articles every now and then where they say, oh, the original Vikings were black. Do you see those ridiculous
I've
articles?
seen a lot of that, particularly on social media.
Exactly. And then there was a recent one about Britain. The Britons were originally black. And see, they're changing it in front of your face. Now, you might laugh at this, right? And we do. And we say it's ridiculous, and people fight against it. But I think they were doing this earlier as well, and people were
Way
fighting
back, yeah.
against it, all right,
Yeah,
back then. But if they control the books and the narrative, and they keep pushing it, so if they keep pushing this for 100 years, then the children at school are learning it. They're not going to think it's ridiculous. They're going to think it's fact.
Well, isn't this what our current day mainstream media is doing? When they want to sell a narrative, they continue to push it and they repeat it to the point where people start to repeat it.
School's the important bit. If they change the books and start teaching the children this stuff, then they're going to believe it. Even though we think it's ridiculous, the future generations won't. Okay, so this is how they change the narrative, and they're doing it in front of us right now before our eyes.
Yeah.
I also wanted to make another point about Phoenicia and Rome. This almost seems to be this eternal conflict. My research has shown that it's the same story between these two, almost Romeo and Juliet, because there was a time when there's a love story between the two as well that people are not aware of, and it's the story of Dido, who was the queen, the first queen of Carthage, falls in love with a Trojan prince, and then he leaves her to found Rome, and she curses him and all future generations, and this is the beginning of this conflict. And I don't know, maybe there's something to that story. I know it's a myth, but it's probably based on something. And
Obviously, myths are based on a certain belief of the time, of course.
yeah, again, the Jews become the new they're the new Phoenicians. So it's still the same people. It's still the same, because I've always said I look at the characters. I don't follow names and places. Follow the character of the people. That by their fruits you shall know them. So if the characters are the same, and this is what I found with the Phoenicians and the Jews, the characters, their customs, their behavior, their occupations are the same. They're the same people, okay? They're just been rebranded.
And you mentioned Edwin Johnson throughout our discussion. Is there anything you want to say with that?
His claim is that the Jews are an offshoot or a branch of the Muslims, okay? So or the Arabs. So Arabs who came into Spain when they invaded and made that into an Islamic nation.
And that would be a very, very controversial belief if you were to go out and promote that today.
Well, yeah,
for
it
obvious
would be.
reasons.
I mean, I've got an article covering that as well, and we probably can discuss that in a future podcast. But yeah, what he doesn't bring up is that Spain was a Phoenician, like I was saying. So that area that the Jews were first, writing the holy books, were all Phoenician colonies. So that's something that Edwin doesn't get into, and that's why I found that connection with the Phoenicians.
Okay, that's been a fantastic discussion. Look, we are running out of time, so I'd like to perhaps hear your final words that ties all of this together.
Okay, so going back to Edwin Johnson, he doesn't mention the Phoenicians in any of his works, but he does state that Judaism began in Spain. Okay, so around 1200 AD as an offshoot of Islam. Okay, so it's an offshoot of Islam. And both of these are based on the Persian Chronicles, or the Avesta, which is the religious literature of Zoroastrianism. I'm still trying to work all this out myself, but again, the Phoenicians are the clue, because the link between Persia and Spain, if we follow Edwin's trail, then the Phoenicians are the ones that brought Islam to the West, because they were the ones who were, they were connected to the Persians and Spain. Right. So they had the colonies in Spain, and they had access to Persia as well from their colonies in Tyre in Syria.
Yes.
Okay. So if they brought it to the West, and I discussed this in an article called "More Than Meets the Eye: The Phoenicians Resurrected," if anyone's interested.
As in more, right. MOOR, not MORE.
Exactly. Yeah. So they would have brought it in as a corruption of the Avesta, right? Yes. Okay, so this becomes the new Islam. Then Judaism is created by a branch separating itself from that main body and making themselves the children of God, rather than the Muslims being the children of God. They become, they've made themselves this special, giving themselves a special title, and then Christianity is the counter doctrine by Rome to reclaim Rome's authority over the world and over these people. So it's a counter doctrine.
Yeah.
Again, I'm still trying to work this out. I'll probably write about that in due course.
Okay. Well, look, this has again been a fascinating discussion, and I know it's going to cause a little bit of controversy for those that listen to the podcast. Once again, the caveat is
good.
Well, it is good, and this is what we try and do. We try and create this discourse so people start to question the narrative, and I think what we've discussed here today has been certainly a very, very good start. So thanks again. I'll remind our listeners they can read the article at your Substack at phoenicianhunter.substack.com, or they can go to our dedicated YouTube channel, which is at On Air Podcast 2025, and that's all hyphenated, but we'll leave the details at the end of this.
Yeah, we'll link it to the bottom of the description.
Yeah. So thanks again, Phoenician Hunter. Appreciate your time, your research, and your insights. It's been a great discussion, and we will regroup again next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and stay well.